Hi guys, I'm Casey Havekes, one of the dairy management specialists with Cornell Cooperative Extension North Country Regional I Team. For those of you that have watched the first video in this series, you'll know that I'm presenting my graduate studies research that I conducted at the University of Guelph under the supervision of Dr. Trevor DeVries. There are some concepts from my first research project that will carry over into this presentation, but don't worry if you didn't get a chance to watch the chop length presentation. This presentation does stand alone and can be followed just as easily. So like the last presentation, this research has recently been published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and you can find the reference at the end of this presentation if you're interested in getting more details. And again, before I dive in, I want to quickly acknowledge and give a big shout out to Trevor for all of his guidance in facilitating this research. These videos would not be available to you without his support and mentorship. All right, so this is part 2 of my grad studies research that looked at investigating characteristics of high-straw dry cow diets to promote consistency in intake for dairy cows across the transition period. And this presentation is going to focus on part 2 that specifically looked at the moisture content of these high-straw dry cow diets on the health, behavior, and performance of dairy cows across the transition period. So just to recap, the transition period is defined as 3 weeks pre-calving to 3 weeks post-calving, and it's characterized by the sudden and dramatic demand for nutrients that's often followed by a lag in dry matter intake. So this puts cows in an inevitable state of negative energy balance, or as seen by the yellow area on the graph, the energy gap. So this happens simply because the energy consumed by the cow cannot meet the energy demand for milk production. And so the cow must rely on body reserves and other means to meet the demand for milk production. So while this is an inevitable state that all cows will experience, we can control the severity of negative energy balance. And one of the ways of doing so is to try to maximize dry matter intake in the weeks leading up to calving to try to supply them with that extra energy that's needed. So a ton of research has been done in this area, and a lot of researchers have focused on how to try to get cows on feed fast after they freshen. But one of the areas that hasn't received as much attention is the dry cow diet. And we now know that the diet consumed by dry cows can be equally important in terms of stimulating intake and early lactation. So one of the strategies to try to reduce the severity of negative energy balance after calving is to try to maximize dry matter intake in the dry period. But we also know that if cows gain excessive body condition in the dry period, they're at greater risk of experiencing metabolic diseases after calving. So the concept of controlled energy dry cow diet feeding has gained a lot of popularity and interest in the past decade. And these diets, or more commonly referred to as the Goldilocks diet, are based on the concept of not too much and not too little. So these diets are designed to allow the cow to maximize her intake while controlling for energy consumption. And this is achieved by incorporating a lot of straw into the diet, or dry hay if that's what you have on hand. So the idea is basically just to provide a bunch of dry forages to the cow that will fill her up and basically satisfy her need to consume feed without allowing her to exceed her energy consumption. So from a physiological standpoint, these diets are really great. After calving, cow metabolic health has been better, and overall the transition has been better. But from a behavioral standpoint, we know that these diets can cause some issues. So first and foremost, these diets are bulky from the high straw content, and this can lead to a decrease in dry matter intake due to gut fill, and they're low in moisture and can lead to an increase in sorting, especially because cows perceive straw to be unpalatable. So in the last presentation, you saw that I looked at minimizing forage particle size to try to maximize intake in the dry period. And while the shorter particle size did in fact increase dry matter intake and reduce sorting, sorting did still occur against those longer forage particles, and there still was a drop in intake as cows approach calving. So we really wanted to see if there was anything else that we could do to try to maximize intake and discourage sorting when cows were fed these diets. So in the past, water has been added to lactating diets to try to minimize sorting, and this is because water is thought to bind the smaller particles to the larger particles and just make the diet physically harder to sort. So when water was added to the lactating diet, it actually resulted in increased sorting against the long forage particles, decreased intake, and increased heating. So none of those are favorable, and we wouldn't want to see that in the dry cow diet. However, it's also important to note that this was in a lactating diet that's primarily in silage forages, and already has a higher moisture content compared to these high straw dry cow diets that are primarily dry forages. So in 2005, some research was done that looked at adding water to a pretty dry ration to begin with. So the dry matter went from 81% to 64%, and this diet was primarily dry forages. When this was done, we saw that cows actually did have a reduced sorting when water was added to the diet. So there is potential for water to reduce sorting in naturally drier diets like these high straw dry cow diets. So why should we care about sorting in the dry period? We know that the risk of acidosis is low. These cows are being fed a high forage, low concentrate diet, and they're probably not going to be experiencing acidosis even if they are sorting. Well, it's important to note here too that sorting is a learned behavior. So some work done with calves has shown that if calves learn a behavior prior to a dietary change, they're more at risk of carrying that behavior over after they transition onto a new diet. And so it could be thought that if dry cows start sorting the dry cow diet, then they'll be more at risk of carrying that behavior over once they transition onto the lactating diet when the risk of acidosis is high, because that lactation diet is usually high in rapidly fermentable carbohydrates and is usually a higher concentrate diet. So even though the risk is low for acidosis in the dry period, they can be more at risk of acidosis post-calving if they do learn that behavior, or at least that's what we are hypothesizing with this research. So we wanted to see if pre-calving dry matter intake could be improved and maintained post-calving, feed sorting could be discouraged, and post-calving performance could be improved by manipulating characteristics of these high straw dry cow diets. And in part 2 of the research, we looked at the impact of water addition. And we hypothesized that adding water would improve intake, reduce sorting, and results in improved metabolic health and performance after calving. So once again, this research was done at the Elora Research Station Dairy Facility, which is at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And we enrolled 40 cows at dry-off, which again was about 42 days before calving, and they were followed for 28 days after calving. At dry-off, cows are fed a high straw dry cow diet, and this is where the previous research kind of comes into play. So in the previous research, we found that the shorter chopped straw resulted in better intake, reduced sorting, and overall better performance. And so we used that shorter chop straw in the second trial. So the dry cow diets were either these high straw dry cow diets that were about 36% wheat straw on a dry matter basis. And then we had our dietary treatment, which was the control, and that had no water added, or we had water added to bring the dry matter down by approximately 10 percentage points. So overall, the dry matter of the control diet was about 54%, and the dry matter of the water diet was about 45%. After calving, all cows were fed the same lactating diet. So this is important going forward when we start looking at the results. Try to keep in mind that the treatment diets were only fed during the dry period, and after calving, all cows were fed the same diet. So we wanted to see if there was any carryover effect from the dry period diets into lactation. So in terms of data collection, we were able to collect daily dry matter intakes and various measures of feeding behavior through the use of these automated feed bins. We collected body weights biweekly in the dry period and daily in lactation. We took blood samples and measured blood beta-hydroxybutyrate and non-esterified fatty acids, both of which are markers of energy balance. We measured rumen pH using these wireless telemetry probes that log rumen pH at 15-minute intervals. And we collected fresh feed samples and refused feed samples. So we collected these feed samples to calculate sorting. So this was done using the Penn State particle separator, and it separates feed into 4 different fractions based on particle size. So you have your long, medium, short, and fine particles, and then we calculated sorting as a percentage. So we used the refused feed sample to calculate the actual intake of that fraction for that cow and divided it by the predicted amount of feed in each fraction based on the fresh feed sample, and then we multiplied that by 100. So values that were less than 100 indicate sorting occurred against that fraction, and values greater than 100 indicate that sorting occurred in favor of that fraction. I won't bore you with all of the stats, but the take home here is that we use SAS software to run the statistics, and data was summarized by status, so either the dry period or the lactating period, and then we used the mixed procedure. We also modeled the change in dry matter intake in rumen pH in the week leading up to calving and the week following calving, and we did that with an analysis of covariance to see if there was a significant linear, quadratic, or cubic effective day. Okay, so getting into the results, the following graphs will all follow a similar layout with the variable of interest along the y-axis and the day or week relative to calving along the x-axis. Cows on the control treatment are shown in purple and cows on the water treatment are shown in blue. So this graph in particular is showing dry matter intake across the transition period. And as you can see, the cows on the water treatment had higher intake in the dry period compared to cows on the control treatment. However, after calving, there was no difference. But what's interesting to see here is as cows approached calving, they started to differ even more in their intake. So if we zoom in on this, we can see that cows on the water treatment had more consistent intake in the week leading up to calving compared to cows on the control treatment. So the drop in intake really started around day -4 relative to calving. Both treatment groups did experience a drop, but cows on the control treatment experienced a bit of a steeper drop compared to cows on the water treatment. So moving on to sorting, once again, as a reminder, values greater than 100 indicate that sorting occurred in favor of that fraction, and values less than 100 indicate that sorting occurred against that fraction. So here we saw that cows on the control treatment did in fact sort to a greater extent than cows on the water treatment for the long particles. So this was expected. We thought that the water would minimize sorting, and this is what we saw. And we also saw that cows on the control treatment tended to sort more in favor of the medium particles compared to cows on the water treatment. And what's interesting to note here is that both treatments sorted against the fine fraction. So if you guys watched my first presentation, you would see that this is something that we weren't expecting. So this kind of reiterates the point that cows just don't like straw fines. And because this project also used the 2.54 centimeter straw, it contributed mostly straw dust and fines to that fine fraction. And that's why, or at least that's why we think the cows sorted against this part. So in terms of feeding rate, cows on the water treatment were able to consume their feed faster compared to cows on the control treatment in the dry period. Or sorry, they tended to consume their feed faster. After calving, there was no difference in feeding rate. So this is really interesting to see too. So usually we don't want to see cows consuming feed super fast. This is what we term slug feeding. And in lactation, when cows are fed a rapidly fermentable diet, this can lead to them experiencing ruminal acidosis. But again, in the dry period, the risk of acidosis is really low, and so consuming feed faster really isn't a huge risk. And what's really interesting to see is that even though cows on the water treatment did consume feed faster in the dry period, they didn't carry that behavior over after calving when the risk of acidosis was high. So this just goes to show that they did not carry over a learned behavior. So moving on to rumen pH, the water treatment cows had less of a drop in rumen pH in the week following calving. So this is likely because cows on the water treatment were able to maintain more consistent intake in that week leading up to calving, and as a result, their rumen was likely a little bit healthier and more suitable for the transition onto this rapidly fermentable lactation diet. And lastly, looking at blood beta-hydroxybutyrate, there was no difference before calving or after calving, but I just wanted to highlight this numerical difference after calving, with control cows having numerically higher BHB levels compared to the water treatment cows at day 7. So on average, the control treatment cows had a BHB reading of 1.2, which is the cutoff for subclinical ketosis, whereas the water treatment cows were below 1. And you can see that at day 4, they were right on par with one another. And then as they got to day 7, the control treatment cows kept on inclining in BHB level, whereas the water treatment actually started to decline. So while this isn't significant, it is kind of interesting to see how this progressed. And if we were able to measure blood beta-hydroxybutyrate levels further into lactation, maybe we would see statistical difference in ketosis levels. Okay, so to wrap it up, the addition of water in the dry cow diet did improve dry matter intake in the dry period. It promoted more consistent intake in the week leading up to calving. It reduced feed sorting against the long forage particles, and it improved rumen health 1 week after calving. So just as a takeaway from this, If you're able to add water to your dry cow diet, this can be a beneficial method for cows to improve their dry matter intake and potentially have better health after calving. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Trevor DeVries again, who was my master's advisor, Dr. Gail Carpenter, and Dr. Todd Duffield for being on my advisory committee, as well as the sponsors for this research project, NSERC, Trial Nutrition, and the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance. So if you have any questions, please direct them to me. My email is listed on the screen there. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. And if you're interested in getting more details on this research, below is the information for the Journal of Dairy Science article where this research is published. All right, thank you, and stay tuned for my last presentation, which is going to be discussing the impact of molasses on these high straw dry cow diets and the impact that it has on cow performance.